students. I'm back with the third and final lesson talking about using the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. So again, our essential question is, how do I solve for x using the quadratic formula? Recall that the quadratic formula is listed here, often sung to Pop Goes the Weasel. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There are far more current versions of that song on YouTube. Feel free to search them if you'd like. However, I want to focus on how to use the quadratic formula today. So recall the a, b, and c come from the coefficients or the numbers that come before the x squared, the x, and the c term. In step 1 of the quadratic formula, it's very important that the equation is always set equal to 0. If it's not set equal to 0, you cannot use the quadratic formula. You would have to first get it set equal to 0. After you have that, identify the a, b, and c values, and finally plug in the values and solve for x. Let's take a look at some cases where you may not be always as sure of what to do. So in our first example, we have it set equal to 0, check. We are then going to identify the a, b, and c. In this case, a is 6, b is negative 4, and c is 5. Notice that I've simply written the letters under each number. Now I'm going to plug them in to the quadratic formula. Notice that b is already negative. So when I write it, I'm going to write it as negative 4 because it's negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So negative 4 squared, remember, always put that in parentheses, minus 4 times 6 times 5, all divided by 2 times 6. Now that we have the quadratic formula filled in, we're going to go ahead and evaluate. Remember, the first rule of thumb is to always type in everything that shows up under the square root. I'm going to grab my calculator and try this on the screen with you. So we have negative 4 squared minus 4 times 6 times 5. When I hit enter, I get negative 104. So we have plus or minus the square root of negative 104. At the beginning, two negatives make a positive. So this would be 4 plus or minus that, all divided by 12. Now, if you went ahead and moved on to the next step, you know that the next thing we do is we evaluate the square root. When I go to the calculator to evaluate the square root of negative 104, I get an error message. It says non-real answer. And the reason this happens is because we are unable to mathematically take the square root of a negative number and get a real answer. We get an imaginary one. In algebra, instead of continuing, we stop here and we say, wait a second, we can't do this. And because we can't do this, we are going to write our answer as no real answer, which basically means we can't answer it yet. Eventually, as you continue to study the math, you'll learn how to evaluate these. For now, let's move on to the next question. I'll clear my calculator so we're all set. In our last example, we have the problem here. Now, I see a couple issues with this problem. First off, it's not in standard form. The x squared term is not coming first. It's also not set equal to 0. So I'm going to begin by subtracting the 2, and then when I rewrite it, I'm going to write it with the x squared term first. So I would have negative 5x squared plus 7x plus 7 equals 0. Next, I'm going to find the a, b, and c values. A is equal to -5, B is equal to 7, and C is equal to 7. Plugging them into the quadratic formula gives me x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times -5 times 7, all divided by 2 times -5. Next, I always tell my students, evaluate what is happening under the square root. Let's go over to our calculator and do that now. Parentheses 7 squared minus 4, sorry about that, times -5 times 7. Awesome. We get 189. So we have -7 plus or minus the square root of 189, all divided by -10. Next, evaluate what is the square root of 189. This we will have to do on the calculator. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. The square root of 189 is equal to 13.75. So we get x equals -7 plus or minus 13.75, all divided by -10. Now, this is the part where I usually tell students, split it up into 2 problems so that it's easier to not lose an answer. What I mean is -7 plus 13.75 divided by -10 and -7 minus 13.75, all divided by -10. You can do this in 2 steps, evaluating the top and then dividing by the bottom. When I did my math, I got 6.75 divided by -10, which gave me -0.675. And on the bottom, I got -20.75 divided by -10, which gave me 2.075. These are not very nice numbers, so therefore this would not be a problem that you could have solved by factoring. It's great to know we have a secondary tool to use when we need to solve for x and find our x-intercepts.